Away you go, Steve.
Thank you very much. Can I thank you, Dr. Bin, for inviting me? Can I thank the students? And can I thank Dr. Honeychurch, who will be hearing later on? Now, my topic, I'm going to jump right in. The topic is the Dominican Story, an assessment of occupational science, embracing social, political, historical, cultural journey towards occupational justice. What is occupational science? Slide number 1. Occupational science studies things people do in their everyday lives and how those occupations influence and are influenced by health and well-being. Occupational science research explores the relationship between occupation and development and how occupation changes over the life course. It addresses how people organize daily occupations and the personal and socio-cultural meanings of occupation. How do we apply the Dominican story of the Kalinagos and Maroons or Negmawo to an assessment of occupational science, embracing the historical, political, social, and cultural journey towards occupational justice? What is occupational justice? Slide 2. Occupational justice is a particular category of social justice related to the intrinsic need for humans to explore and act on the environment in ways that provide healthy levels of intellectual stimulation and allow for personal care and safety, subsistence, pleasure, and social participation. I believe that the model of human occupation, MOHO, provides the theoretical lens for me to examine the Dominican story. Slide number 3. What is MOHO? Model of human occupation. Kleinhofer's model of human occupation represents the crux of what occupational therapists do. In MOHO, a person interacts with the environment in a dynamic cycle. The model consists of 3 parts: A, volition, B, performance, and C, habituation. Using the MOHO model, I will attempt to assess how the Kalinagos, Maroons, Negmawo, and their descendants interacted with their environments through the process of volition, performance, and habituation in Dominica and in England. What is volition? Slide 4. Volition, according to Friedrich Nietzsche, is the will to power, which is the foundational drive in all human beings. It is our capacity to control our daily life, activities, and destiny. It is having the freedom to command ourselves. A person has the confidence to make things happen, set goals, determine their values, interests, and the things that give them pleasure. No other human group best exemplify volition than the Dominicans, Kalinagos, Negmawo or Maroons, and their descendants. They have become habituated to it over centuries and passed these traits to their progeny in their genes and through epigenetics. Habituation. Habituation relates to a person's roles, habits, and routines, and how these interact to shape occupational participation and performance. Slide number 5. I just want to pause there because there's a lot coming at you, and just a quick pause for reflecting on it. Let it marinate in your mind, and if you have any quick thoughts, just write them down, and Dr. Blaine will read it out what you have written. I'm just going to give you just 30 seconds before I move on to slide number 5. Occupational performance, slide 5. The ability to perceive, desire, recall, plan, and carry out roles, routines, tasks, and subtasks for the purpose of self-maintenance, productivity, leisure, and rest in response to demands of the internal or external environment. Assessment of history of Kalinago, slide 6. I know Dr. Honcha we go into some depth about it. I'm just really doing a summary of this. Carbon dating reveal that the Kalinagos arrived in Dominica in 1200. They migrated on canoes down the Orinoco River in South America to the Atlantic Ocean. The fast-flowing ocean currents drove the Kalinago canoes first to Trinidad, then to Dominica. The Kalinagos met the peaceful native Arawak people on the island. They killed the men and cohabited with the Arawak women. They had the island all to themselves. Dominica is mountainous, heavily forested with over 300 fast-flowing rivers. The Kalinagos built canoes, fished, caught small game, and grew cassava and yams. They lived free according to nature. And here we got to look at I think the core, the fundamental aspects of volition at a philosophical level. And that notion of perfect state of nature is very, very important. I really believe that to Kalinagos and to OTs as well. Slide number 7, perfect state of nature. The opening sentence of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's book on Discourse on Inequality reads, "Man is born free, but everywhere is in chains." Of course, that was back in the 18th century, so he wasn't, women are included, of course, in there. Rousseau used the Kalinagos as his model of freedom. Unfortunately, he referred to them as noble savages. In the second treatise, the philosopher John Locke argues all men are naturally in a state of perfect freedom in order to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit. They have a right to life, liberty, and property. That sounds very much like Thomas Jefferson, famous inalienable rights upon which the United States Constitution is based, of course. Each person is naturally entitled, I'm continuing with Locke, to execute the inalienable rights against anyone who infringes them, close quotes. Locke is explaining the moral foundation of volition and fitted the Kalinagos' worldview and mindset perfectly. A Roman Catholic missionary, according to, and it's in Dr. Hoincher's book, a Roman Catholic missionary sent to convert the Kalinagos to Roman Catholicism wrote this about their passion for liberty. There are no people in the world so jealous of their liberty or who resent the smallest check on their freedom. They laugh at us for obeying and respecting our rulers and say that we must be slaves. Arabs have always been a bellicose people who are proud and indomitable and prefer death to slavery, close quotes. Like Britain, the Kalinagos of Dominica were never slaves. For over 200 years, the Kalinagos fought fiercely until European powers were encroached on their property, Dominica. Slide number 8, time of conflict against the colonists. Now, there's a research have been done showing the conflicts between 1500 and 1714. There were about 67 recorded battles between the Kalinagos and colonists. From the map provided to us by Dr. Robin, you would see that the islands are very close together, just canoes away, where a few miles, not few miles, but 20 plus miles away. So you can imagine that the battles intensified when the English were colonizing St. Kitts in 1623, Barbados in 1625, Nevis in 1628, Antigua and Montserrat in 1632, Jamaica 1,000 miles away in 1655, the French colonized Martinique, Guadeloupe, and St. Lucia in 1635, Grenada in 1649, Dominica and St. Vincent Grenadines formed a military alliance to keep plantation slavery off the islands and had a peace treaty signed in 1660 by the French and English to leave Dominica and St. Vincent alone. Pause. Think about the battles, think about the need for people to protect the land. That's a human right, that's a natural right. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think the Kainagos more than anyone else sort of did this. But I just want to give an opportunity to reflect on those facts. Dr. Honche will go into a lot more detail.
I would like to add how amazing that sounds, leave Dominica alone. So not only do we have a resistance gene, it's true, it's in law, leave us alone. Leave us alone. Wow, really powerful. Any comments from students, please? Just fill the chat. Any inspiration you're getting, fill the chat, please. Thank you, Steve. Continue.
Intermittent battles, disease, and old age reduced the number of Kalinagos to about 400 in 1714. You can find that information from, again, by the copy of his book, called The Two Books, written by, I'm doing a plug for Dr. Honeychurch. It's all in Dr. Honeychurch's book. There's a time for everything. The Kainagos' time to fight was over after 1714 because their numbers were depleted, and they withdrew to the eastern part of the island. Their territory has expanded to 3,700 acres and a population about, present-day population about 3,000. The 2011 census of Dominica reveals that 56.5% of the population are males and 43.5% females. The Kalinagos have been living in Dominica for 823 years. Slide number 9. Kalinagos and Africans on the Caribbean Sea. The tradition of runaway slaves dates back as far as the 1580s, when many of the Spanish settlers from Puerto Rico were held captive by the Kalinagos in Dominica. Many escaped into the mountains interior. Stop and pause. When I went to Puerto Rico, something amazing happened to me. I felt so comfortable in Puerto Rico. My surname is Delsol. It's a Spanish surname. It's not a slave name because the Spanish were captives. They were not colonizers. It's very important to and I'll say something about the Delsols later on in an anthropological study I did in 1999. But there is in a verse, for example, 2019 says that the Igbo philosophy, now 60%, I said that later, verse says that the Igbo philosophy of the Dominican Maroons was the reason for their success. He calculated that 60% of African slaves brought to Dominica were of Igbo origin. I know for a fact my relationship with Igbos is quite out of the ordinary. And it's a place in Igbo called Aba. I really believe that's where my family came from, Aba. Now, Sir William Stapleton, 1671 to 1688, was the governor of the Leeward Islands, he reported to the government in London that 1,500 Kalinagos in long war canoes were waging war against the colonists. What caught my attention was that among that number was 600 African bowmen. What are 600 African bowmen doing with the Kalinagos? This is quite extraordinary. These Africans were performing a double function because the term bowman means archers and also rowers. So they're rowing the boat, but they're also archers as well. So here you've got an alliance between Kalinagos and Africans fighting for their freedom on the Caribbean Sea, not in the mountains, on the sea, taking the battle to the colonists. Different kind of struggle. Dominica and St. Vincent had become free zones for African refugees fleeing the harsh regime of the plantations, sugar plantations in nearby islands. I was born on the island of Dominica in the village of Scotshead. You cannot live on the coast not to be aware of ocean currents, that the current from Martinique will take boats to Dominica. Current coming from Guadeloupe will take boats to Portsmouth, that particular area. So you'd imagine escaping slaves on rafts would come to Dominica. Dominica was like a refuge over centuries for escaping slaves. Maroons in the mountains, a different kind of battle. They're now in the mountains. In the trials transcript of the Maroons, Governor Ainslie described them as a state within a state. And they did not recognize the legitimacy of the slaves' laws. Now, that is very important. They did not recognize the legitimacy of the slave laws. It's well and good for someone to say you are a slave, but do you yourself define yourself as a slave? That's the question. And then you can see the link now to Nietzsche about the will to power, and also to Locke as well. Those Maroons, those Africans had a very strong sense of their humanity. They knew who they were, and they defended their humanity till death. Very much exemplified by the Maroon leader called Bala. Bala really is, for me, really is a major symbol of struggle of the Maroons. Governor Ode wrote to the Secretary of State, Viscount Sidney, on the 16th of April, 1786. He said, he, Bala, refused answering almost any question that were put to him, though perfectly in his senses. He called upon his captors repeatedly to cut off his head, telling them that that Bala would not die. His Obi or charm or his child, 5-year-old son, were the only things that he expressed any anxiety. Dr. Holy Church will go into the symbolism of it all and no doubt talk about Bala, so I'm not going to say any more about Bala, but you can see the resistance, you can see the strength of the character of Bala, and I really believe that Bala is a symbol as well as a motif and a metaphor for that strong Dominican character, which I'll talk about later on. Now, what was it all about? It was about profit. Persons were converted to property for the sake of profit. And then we come to slide number 10, the French occupation. Coffee and cocoa production in 1763. 1763 was the time that the British began plantation slavery. I'm talking about in particular sugar in Dominica. But before that, so 1760 is a very good cutoff point in terms of the history of Dominica. The French were sort of doing control, loosely. So see the amount of land under cultivation. Acres of cultivated land was 3,227 acres. Amount of cocoa produced was 271,650 pounds. Amount of coffee produced was 1,690,368 pounds. Amount of manioc produced was 9,973 barrels. Now we can find again in Dr. Honch's book, In the Forest of Freedom. Get that book, please. The Fighting Maroons of Dominica, 2017.
I have a question. I have a question, Steve. Can students just take a little photograph of this slide?
Very much so.
What you've got to do is get a sense of, these are no machines, folks. There's no implements to do this agriculture. Yeah, it's just man, woman, boys and girls, and under the supervision of a slave foreman. All right. And this food is going to go back where? Back to Britain, or where's it going? Where's all this food
going? To France. It's going to France. It's going to Martinique,
right,
to feed the slaves in Guadeloupe and Martinique and elsewhere. Okay. Export from Dominica. They were very productive. Slide number 11 gives you the population. It took us right into the population, the people who actually produced. The French inhabitants, Slide 11, 1,718. The free Africans and mixed race people were 500. The African slaves, working adults, 3,145. And the children, 2,113. Now, I found that very interesting because the slave system up to that time was benign enough. I don't call it slavery, I call it paternalistic servitude under the French. That wasn't a harsh form of slavery under the English. And therefore, where you have harsh slavery, you got a reduction in number of children. Where you have a much more softer, you got a lot more children being born. So I think that's a kind of a high number of children being born under that softer form of slavery under the French. Dr. Hoynchez, no doubt, will come and with the facts and come against it. I don't mind. It's not about me. It's about us having a real discussion about it. I'm stopping here to any reflections on the figures. Anyone at all? Before I move into a different aspect, following one of the rivers, the streams, 365 River in Dominica. And I'm going to locate in Grand Bay. I'm going to Grand Bay in a minute. Any comment if I go to Grand Bay?
We've got a question, and just for clarification, yes, pull up a Google of Dominica map, and even run a search for Grand Bay. That way, in real terms, you'll be keeping up to date as Stephen navigates the island. Is that okay, folks? But we got a comment here from Cassie. Cassie asks, am I right to assume that mixed race people will have come from the rape of female slaves by slave owners and their families? So trigger warnings.
Not necessarily. I don't, not necessarily. One of the things, and I know that Dr. Hunches has got more information on this than I have. The Kalinagos, because they were fighting and the men went fighting on those long war canoes, would have been losing men during those fights, leaving the women behind, okay? And Vass tells us that 60% of the slaves coming from Igbo, a large number of them were women, because genetically speaking, women the XX chromosomes give them an advantage. More of them would have survived the Middle Passage than men would have. So therefore, I really believe that in Dominica, there have always been an excess of women. And hence, I don't really think in terms of the rape, I don't know. I mean, we can only interrogate the data. We were not there. We can only sort of look at the information and then interrogate and come up with the best reasoning that we possibly can. But I don't think the rape was as common in Dominica because of an excess of women. That's my belief from the data I've read so far.
But Cassie, it's still a relevant question, and although powerful, in North America, in the main, in America is, a lot more harsher. There was all sorts of breeding colonies, breeding farms. It sounds harsh, doesn't it? There's all sorts of cruel things happening, and in this system, and the result could mean
I think Kathy's question is a very, very relevant one. I lived in 15 years in South Carolina. I was a group meeting at appeared on one of the televisions for 4 times on television. On the site where the television studio was built was a slave camp where they bred slaves, the same site. And the people who owned it, their descendants, you should see the physical condition of them, because they were breeding Africans with mild-mannered Indians from Tennessee to get a special kind of house slave. So, and they had them distributed. There was oil camp in different parts of South Carolina, and of course, different parts of the South as well. So Cap is right. The Americans' form of slavery was very harsh. And you cannot travel from America, and I traveled extensively down the South, not feeling, you can feel the pain in some of those places. You can feel the energy is still there, of suffering is still there. Can I move on to Grand Bay now? Right. Grand Bay, a place called Hull. A mulatto man named Juno Roll began plantation slavery in Grand Bay. It was planting of coffee. Maroon resistance to slavery began in Grand Bay. These Maroons and their progeny were never defeated. My mother was born in Grand Bay, 86 years after slavery was abolished. As a child, I went with my mother to a garden at the top of a mountain. And I'm writing an autobiography on my mother right now called My Mama Who Daddy Me. It's written in rhyming couplets, and that is just part of the paragraph of the beats of me climbing that mountain with my mom to get to the top. It goes something like this. Mama and me left the village behind us, began to climb the steep slope before us, needing strong arms and legs for muscle power to stop us from sliding because of a heavy shower. Long vines hang down from the tall trees. Mama held on tightly to 2 long vines. I held tightly to Mama's shirt to stop me drop. 2 mountain climbers pull ourselves up. Toes clawed tree roots in precipitous climb, moved up at snail's pace, 1 step at a time. Breathing heavily to suck oxygen in our air sac, we rested frequently to get our breath back. We were 1,000 feet above sea level. Thin mountain air slowed the pace of our travel. Finally, we reached the mountain summit, exhausted at the end of our energy limit. We instinctively followed an old maroon track used by maroon warriors to escape enemy attack. The summit was a fertile, dormant volcanic crater, a circular ring of hillocks with hole in the center. Soil fertility produced free fruit crops yearly. Maroons raised their family in secluded colony. Maroons reproduced after their kind in Dominican England, you will find. So here is I believe, a poignant, I need to write this bit in a poetic form to give a flavor of that climb. I can still see it in my mind's eye. I wonder if any reactions. Was anyone climbing with me? Imaginatively.
We've got some comments. Thank you for sharing, Stephen. Very moving, says Anderton. Sorry, Amy Anderton. Sophie said, thank you for sharing. Cassie says, sorry for the girls. Thank you, Stephen, for sharing. Thank you. Please, we got 20 odd people in the class. Let's pack the comments, please. If I may, I'm trying to be polite. Just give something back. Our professors are giving to you today. Give something back. Just pack that comments, please. Just get typing. Continue, sir. What would you like me to do next?
Right. We're going to the biology of it all. I'm a biologist as well as a psychologist. So I love looking at the genetics of it because DNA is history. DNA replicates after its kind continuously since the beginning of humankind. So DNA is history. We cannot talk about anything about OT or occupational therapy without getting to the genetics of the situation. So natural selection, next slide. Through the process of natural selection, maroon genes were transmitted. Natural selection is the process through which populations of living organisms adapt and change. Individuals in a population are naturally variable. Their variation means that some individuals have traits better suited to the environment than others. That's what they call survival of the fittest. Individuals with adaptive traits that give them some advantage are more likely to survive and reproduce. These individuals then pass the adaptive traits on to their offsprings. Over time, these advantageous traits become more common in the population. Through this process of natural selection, favorable traits are transmitted through generations. So if you think about it, from the time of the capture of the African people from their home, the marching down to the coastline, they're losing people because they have been injured, because of they don't mentor, whatever. They get to the coast and there's a long wait and they're losing people as well. Then time comes for the transportation across the Atlantic. There's a ship surgeon. He then examines the people, 2 lines, one for those who are fit to travel physically and mentally, and those who are not fit to travel, another selection process. Then they get into that little cubby hole, some die, and then they get onto the ship. Then to Middle Passage, they're losing people, 2 to 3 million people lost, 12 million left the African coast, and about 9 million arrive on the other side. So you can see from a biological point of view, natural selection is taking place. And, people who are, for whatever reason. So the tough survives, the fittest survive, physically and mentally. So therefore, slide number 14, we have a very, very important moral concept. Part of the whole is dignity. The concept of human dignity is the belief that all people hold a special value that is genetically tied to their common humanity. It has nothing to do with their class, race, gender, religion, abilities, or any other factor than they being human. 99% of our genes are commonly shared. That's what makes us genetically one race. We are one race genetically. But we have the social constructs, as Dr. Robin was saying. The next important idea is self-efficacy. Slide number 15, that was transmitted. Self-efficacy, very similar to volition, another aspect of volition, refers to individual's belief in his or her capacity to execute actions necessary to produce specific performance and attainments. Self-efficacy reflects confidence in one's ability to exert control over one's own motivation and actions in different social environments. Now, the person who actually came up with that concept is a psychologist called Albert Bandura in 1967, says that people have a sense of agency because of a strong belief that they can produce desired effects by their actions. If that belief is absent, then they have little incentive to act. Self-efficacy belief is a major basis of action. People guide their lives by the beliefs of personal efficacy. And then we move to resilience. Before you go to resilience, there's another study done about the genetics of it. These were twin studies. And they found that's what was based on 1,394 adolescent twin pairs. And the dependent variable was self-efficacy. And the result shows that 75% of the variation in self-efficacy, volition, was due to genetic factors. 75%. Non-shared environmental causes was only 25%. So self-efficacy, volition was passed down from the Kalinagos, from the Maroons to present generation. Another characteristic, resilience. We talk a lot about resilience. Slide number 16, resilience. Resilience is being able to recover and adapt over time from setbacks, traumatic events, obstacles, or stresses. Resilience is not instant. It takes a long time to develop. It is a kind of inner strength, grit, toughness, and fortitude. When a person recovers from challenging experiences, they develop growth and lifelong learning mindset. Recent research has begun to identify the environmental, genetic, epigenetic, and neural mechanisms that underlie resilience, and has shown that resilience is mediated by adaptive changes in several neural circuits involving numerous neurotransmitters and molecular pathways. These changes shape the functioning of the neural circuits that regulate reward, fear, emotion, reactivity, and social behavior, which together are thought to mediate successful coping of stress. Dominica is one of the islands in the Caribbean that have experienced more hurricanes. Just 2015, we had Superstorm Sandy. 2017, we had Maria. And we have had this, and people in Dominica have a capacity for recovery. They're very resilient. It didn't come overnight because you had to be resilient to survive in the forest of Dominica as a Maroon. So that resilience genes have been passed on. No wonder Dominicans recover quickly from hurricanes. Let's move on to epigenetics. What does it mean? Epigenetics, another factor of epigenetics is the study of how our behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way our genes work. Unlike genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible and do not change our DNA sequence. The sequence of 4 bases: adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine. These replicates constantly unless there's a mutation. That's the 4 bases. Now, genetics, epigenetics don't change that. It's a switch on top of those that, depending on the environment, it can either switch the gene on or switch it off. You don't know if you are living in your comfort zone, in your area, you will never know your true ability. When you move out, get off your comfort zone, and then you find that epigenetics take over and you begin certain things you think you cannot do, you start doing it. While genetic changes can alter which protein is made, epigenetic changes affect gene expression to turn genes on and off. Since our environment and behaviors, such as diet and exercise, can result in epigenetic changes, it is easy to see the connection between our genes, behaviors, and environment. Pause. Any thoughts about natural selection, gene expression, and epigenetics from anyone? I think that's a very, very important part of my talk.
One thing that I became familiar with in my years of scholarly exploration about the journey, I ask a lot of public health questions about the African Caribbean demographic, linked to conditions like type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity. These are highly prevalent as a proportion of our representations in the UK context, probably North America and even Australia. And Professor Beckles, University of the West Indies, he's presented the hypothesis that, you know, over years of poor diet, you know, what was the diet of slaves? You know, carbohydrates, you know, all the fuel foods, breadfruit from Tahiti. You know, we eat now a lot of yams, dasheen, plantain. You know, years of that. You know, how were things refrigerated during slavery time? How was food preserved? A lot of salt was used. Even when I grew up as a boy, salt fish and curing meats. Salt is very important in the absence of technology like a refrigerator. So a lot of our foods were salted. So if the body is fed that for generation after generation as a sort of an environmental impact, it's going to predispose the metabolism in terms of processing. And there's also a kind of a middle passage hypothesis too. Those who survived also were predisposed. The kidneys changed over time in terms of how we filtered things.
Let's come back to that. Let me just, because I know I've got 10 minutes left, let me just, slide number 18, the Moho model applied to Grand Bay farmers as entrepreneurs in Dominica. We're coming to the question of economic justice here with the Grand Bay farmers. Stay in Grand Bay, that's where slavery started, that's where the Maroons started. Grand Bay farmers. They grew more ground provisions to meet their food. That was when I was in the 50s and happened long before that. They grew more ground provisions to meet their food need and sold the excess in the capital city of Roseau, as well as the villages of Scotshead. Every Saturday, we couldn't grow own food. It was only stones, of course, in Scotshead. They exchanged ground provisions for fish in Scotshead. No money was exchanged as fish for food. And a few became hucksters. They were people who traveled by boat to the French islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe, as well as Antigua. Now, this practice of hucksters is centuries old. Parcel, for example, one of the Maroon leaders, was seen many times doing that kind of stuff, and other people as well. So the Kalinagos used to trade with that's how Juno Roll came to Dominica. So the idea of trading is got a long history in Dominica with African people of African origin, and also the Kalinagos as well. So slide number 19, Moho applied to Grand Bay farmers as entrepreneurs in London. Following that group, my mother, following that group, I know them well. We're all related. They're my family. Grand Bay farmers migrated, the same farmers migrated to London in the 50s and 60s. They reside in Forest Gate in the London borough of Newham. They brought their spirit of entrepreneurship with them. They don't leave them in Dominica, they bought them in London. They sold ground provisions to the Caribbean community in Paddington. I saw them every Saturday. They lived close to abattoirs and butchers and gathered the parts of pigs and cattle and chicken that butchers used to throw away. These former Granby farmers made a fortune selling this to customers all over London. They were the first house owners among Caribbean people in London. Some bought a number of houses and rented their rooms to Caribbean migrants over the years, and many sold them, went back to the thing, built big houses, and live happily ever after. Slide 20, Muhammad applied to Bernard Wilshire. Bernard Wilshire, who I know well. Bernard Wilshire, his mother was born in Grand Bay. His father was born in Barbados. A public intellectual, a human rights lawyer, historian, former Attorney General of Dominica, former deputy leader of the Inland Education Authority, and creator of Black History Month. That's Bernard Wilshire's creation. Bernard Wilshire is head of the Bala Congress Chambers. He is a human rights lawyer, historian, community activist. He was born in Dominica, as I said. Came to London in his early teens, attended Hackney Downs Grammar School. He studied history at York University and law at London University. Bernard started the Kwame Nkrumah Society School in Hackney in the early 1970s, one of the first in London. Bernard returned to Dominica to help organize the independence movement and educate the young people of Dominica to push the Patrick government. He didn't want to seek independence from Britain. It was Bernard Wilshire and Lucy Douglas were the two main pushers, pushing Dominicans to go for independence. The country gained independence in November, the 1st November 1978. Bernard is a former Attorney General of Dominica. Now, slide 21, model applied to Lady Patricia Scotland. Lady Patricia Scotland of Astral. Lady Patricia Scotland is a British diplomat, barrister, and politician serving as the 6th Secretary General of the Commonwealth of Nations. Lady Scotland was born in Dominica, came to England with her parents when she was 2 years old. She's the 10th child of a family of 12, born to Roman Catholic parents. She attended London University, Anglia Ruskin University, and Middle Temple. At the age of 35 years, Lady Scotland was the youngest woman, black or white, ever to be made a Queen's Counsel, QC, in 1991. She was also the first woman, black or white, to be appointed as Attorney General of Britain. She was Deputy Home Secretary under 3 Home Secretaries, David Blunkett, Charles Taylor, and John Reed. None of them were lawyers, and was the de facto, and she was really the de facto Home Secretary. Lady Scotland has drafted and crafted laws on the land reform, immigration, criminal justice, human rights, family law, and domestic violence legislation. No one has had a greater influence over British legislative history than Lady Scotland since the Second World War. As Commonwealth Secretary General, Lady Scotland has oversight of the legal structure of 54 countries with a population of 2.63 billion people. In Brexit Britain, no trade deals with any of these countries happen without the active involvement of Lady Scotland. It is no wonder that the late Queen Elizabeth I and the present King Charles III and Queen Camilla hold her in such high regard. I pause. 3 minutes. I'm moving fast because time is running. I did an anthropological study of the village of Scotshead in 1999, 32 families in the village of Scotshead, the place of my birth. And you can see the surnames English. The surnames are George, English, John Louis, Peter, Simon. Then you got lots of French, Etienne, Gervier, Tavernier, Perrier, Paquette, Nicholas, Augustine, Blow, Jantor, and Delsol. Let me focus them on two families, Paquette and Delsol families. The Paquette and Delsol families have maroon roots in Grand Bay. They are genetically related, and they produce from the second generation 100% graduates. They are making a contribution, impacting the generation. And I just want to finish off with this slide. My name is Professor Delsol. My middle name is Paul. Here's background information about my education. I attended Boys Academy, passed my exam with glee, attended London University, got a degree in biology, and also in psychology. I'm a spoken word poet, write lines in rhyming couplets, write of autobiography, focusing on my life journey. I'm a positive psychologist, a legal sociologist, a youth and community worker, children and young people mentor, was a former science teacher, was a multicultural lecturer, student expert and motivator, occupational therapy educator, and former school inspector, community division director, an action research center, worked as an action researcher, teachers in service training facilitator, MC and PhD student research tutor, helped on problem solutions, provide cause-effect explanations, and policy recommendations. For funders and politicians, created access to higher education for people with no English or maths qualification, to study at college and university, to work hard for a degree, to get a job with more money, to live a life of luxury, climb ladder of social mobility, far away from poverty, created the youth far away from poverty. And that is my end of my lecture.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much indeed. Look, well, really, yeah, folks, give me some hands up on the chat there for Stephen, please. Thank you. Really thoughtful, Stephen, and I mean, our whole module is about occupational justice, and I'm really struck by from hearing you speak that empire, colonialism, and imperialism absolutely affects us all. It is, and I suppose the task is how do we consciously bring that into our practice when we work with people within the city of Leeds. There's going to be an interesting conversation about how do we make use of this knowledge and information to make more relevant occupational therapy. Absolutely. Stephen, are you staying until the end?
I am. I'm not moving.
All right. Okay, cool. Because we were suggesting that we have questions and thoughts right at the end. If that's indeed. Okay, that would be lovely. Oh, yes. Thank you. So, Blaine, are you all right? In Lennox. And,
yes, I'm just going to ask Lennox, is it okay if we have a toilet break for 1 minute, Lennox, if you can hear us? Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Please do. I'm ready here for you all. I just want to find out the possibility of putting on slides.